Welcome to the Good Reading Podcast, proudly sponsored by Book People Gift Cards. A Book People gift card is the perfect gift for readers of all ages. Simply order your gift card online at bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au. Redeem at any one of over 500 bookshops across Australia. Visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au. Dr. Norman Swan is a physician, journalist and broadcaster with a career that spans more than 30 years. He's been the host of ABC Radio National's The Health Report since 1985 and is the winner of 4 Walkley Awards. He is the best-selling author of So You Think You Know What's Good for You and So You Want to Live Younger, Longer. Today I'm talking to Dr. Norman Swan about his new book, So You Want to Know What's Good for Your Kids. Dr. Norman Swan, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you very much.
So You Want to Know What's Good for Your Kids focuses on children in the early years of life, from birth up to around 10 years of age. Why have you chosen this age range in particular?
The reason for going beyond 5 is that there are plenty of books around for parents and lots of support for parents in the early years, first 2 years of life. And then there's this gap and information starts again in adolescence. And parents are told, don't worry about these, they're called the middle years. Don't worry about these middle years. They're the salad days. You can kick back and enjoy them and until the dark clouds of adolescence hit your family. And the reality is these are a neglected period of childhood, both by researchers and policymakers. And parents have been misled by this idea that they're the salad years. They're incredibly important years, and they're the runway to not just adolescence, but the rest of the child's life. And there's very little on the shelves, by the way, for this age group as well. And there are 2 periods of brain plasticity in a child's, really significant brain plasticity. Our brains remain plastic to some extent for all of our lives, but as we become adults, they're less and less plastic. But there are 2 periods of a lot of plasticity in a child's life, and they're in the first 10 years. The first 2 years of life, when the baby's brain is growing like topsy, the baby's brain is being shaped, all the learning pathways are being developed, and the influences on that changing brain in the first 2 years are mostly parents, grandparents, childcare, and a bit in terms of the external environment, the village, if you like, around the child. But what happens in those first 2 or 3 years of life is that the brain grows like topsy, as I said, and it's almost like an overgrown brain because the child's just absorbing everything. And there's no editing, in a sense. And that doesn't prepare you for adulthood. To prepare you for adulthood, the brain's got to be pruned and trimmed, made more efficient, essentially honed for adulthood. And that starts to happen towards the end of those first 10 years of life through into early adolescence. And there, the influences are still parents, carers, school, but increasingly it's the external environment that has an influence on the child's developing brain, which is the way it needs to be because it's preparing the child for life in the outside world. A critical period in a child's development. And those second 5 years of that 10 have been neglected.
The first section of your book seems designed to put parents' minds at ease, and there are 4 takeaways that jumped out at me. And the first is history and genes are not destiny.
Parents are always looking at their kids and how much of this is me, how much of this is my partner, how much of this is the outside world, and wondering what's going on. But also they've been told stories about how genes change during life and can change the child's destiny. And how I describe genes in the book is as the blank canvas of life. We're born with a canvas, which is genetic, but we paint on that canvas. And the painting that results is in our power. Yep, the nature of the canvas dictates a lot, but very rarely more than about 50%. So there's a lot of leeway in how we paint that canvas. And the people who paint that canvas are parents, grandparents, childcare centers, school, and the external environment all come together to paint that. But the canvas does not dictate what your destiny will be. The world around the child has a significant influence.
The second one is that a lower than average birth weight should not prey on your mind.
Research has suggested that low birth weight is associated with high blood pressure and heart disease later in life. You've got to be careful not to generalize here. There are some babies that are born at low birth weight because the mother has smoked and the mother has experienced extreme disadvantage. And that disadvantage is reflected in the low birth weight and not a good thing. But for most low birth weight, according to recent research, is that a mother who gives birth to a low birth weight baby often has genes herself that make it more likely that she has a low birth weight baby. In other words, it's a genetic phenomenon rather than necessarily an environmental one. So the environmental causes of low birth weight are not good, but sometimes a baby's born low birth weight with no disadvantage, and the mother hasn't smoked, she's had a healthy pregnancy, and the baby's born at low birth weight. And sure enough, these babies do have a higher risk of particularly high blood pressure later in life. But what's going on here almost certainly is that the same genes that give you a baby with low birth weight have a dual function. And the second function, the second side effect of that genetic pattern is high blood pressure later in life. In other words, the high blood pressure is genetically programmed in the same way as the low birth weight was by the same genes. That's the theory here. And therefore, low birth weight in itself is not necessarily a terrible thing for the child. It's not great, but there's often not much you can do about it in a woman who's otherwise had a terrific pregnancy and done all the right things.
The third one is what happens after birth is pretty much always more important than what happens during pregnancy.
Yes, there's a story in the book about this. I tell 3 stories about genes and destiny. One is called Call the Midwife, television show of the same name. And this is where the idea that pregnancy is the most important thing, this is where this came from. A midwife called Ethel Burnside in Hertfordshire in England, looking at the terrible state of Britain's babies around the turn of the 19th and 20th century, got an army of midwives together who delivered babies, weighed them, visited the mothers at home, gave them advice about nutrition, weighed them again, and kept quite good records of their visits and these children. A researcher called Professor David Barker found those records, got access to those records, and then tracked them through to people who were still alive in England at the time, and found that low birth weight was associated with earlier onset of dementia, high blood pressure, essentially shorter lives. And I'm doubling back to the answer to the previous question. He concluded that what happened during pregnancy determined this child's life, and that what happened afterwards was less important. It turns out that he made some errors in his research, and it wasn't quite as deterministic as that. Yes, as I said before, low birth weight is associated with higher blood pressure later on in life, but that may be genetic. But his conclusion was that pregnancy determined a lot. And long story short, the evidence is that what happens after pregnancy counts for an awful lot more. And so it's not that it's unimportant what happens in pregnancy, but once the baby's born, what happens to that child is incredibly important for the future of its life.
And in the fourth takeaway, I think you actually cite some of those things that might influence, and they are a stable, high-quality physical environment, good schooling, secure, high-quality housing, job opportunities, economic security, healthy lifestyle. All of these things make a difference, and that none of those things are actually in your genes.
No. What a lot of that adds up to is this idea that it takes a village to raise a child. And I describe research in the book by the late Professor Clyde Hertzman at University of British Columbia, where he developed a measure of early development called the EDI, the Early Development Index or Instrument. And so this is a measure of a child's development. Then he did surveys in Vancouver of EDIs across Vancouver and found, probably unsurprisingly to people listening to us talking, that in areas of lower wealth, lower education, poorer social infrastructure, higher levels of air pollution, fine particulate air pollution, the early development index levels of those children was lower. But what he also found was, if you compared like children with like, so children from richer household, better educated parents, et cetera, with the same family in a wealthy suburb, wealthy zip code, the child living in the area with poorer resources had a lower EDI. So in other words, just the area in which they lived pulled down that child's development. So the village plays a really important part. So it's all those things that you're talking about. It's about open spaces. It's about clean air to breathe. It's about the quality of schools. There's all sorts of things that happen in the village. The idea of safety, public safety, that you can go out and play and feel safe in that environment. All those things have an influence.
Let's turn to one of the really core elements of the book, and that is parenting. And you talk about or use the term transmissibility in parenting. What do you mean by that?
There is a sense that you learn your parenting skills from your parents before you, and that you repeat what you learned. What I'm trying to counteract a lot in the book is a sense in parents that things are inevitable when they're not necessarily inevitable. A lot is within your power and the power of politicians and others to change the shape of things and change outcomes. I've been doing a lot of talks in front of audiences about this book. And every time I give a talk, I ask people to put up their hands in the audience if they're parenting or they decided to parent in a different way from the parenting that they received. And almost everyone in the room puts up their hand. In other words, people feel that there's something about the parenting they had that they don't want to repeat. Now, I've not burrowed down into what that is. Sometimes it will be quite toxic things that they don't want to repeat. Sometimes it will be about discipline, be all sorts of things, but they don't want to repeat this notion. What I've been determined to do in this book is not give generalized advice. Parents have got advice coming out of their ears, so much advice, it's really hard to be a parent these days. Who do you believe? And what I've done is done the hard work for parents. I've gone through the evidence, I've summarized the evidence, I've checked it with experts, and you can rely on what I've said in the book in an area. And then you're an adult, you can make up your own mind about how to do things. But one of the things I say in the book more than once is that parenting is a game of tennis. You serve, the child returns. You return on that child's return. And every child plays tennis a different way. So you've got some kids, if you've got more than one kid, you'll know that you've got a kid that you serve to them and they return on a topspin and you're running to the corner of the court. You return out of breath and they do another topspin to the other side of the court and you're completely knackered by this process. And other children will just flick the ball back to you in a very straight bat or racket. And what that means is that the style of parenting that you've got is different for each child. If you've been led by a parenting book to believe that one size fits all, it's not necessarily going to work for all your kids. It might work for the kid who gives you a straight back, but the one who's good at topspin, you might be struggling to apply what you think is the perfect parenting. And what I say here is, don't aim to be the perfect parent. It's a bad thing, actually, to aim for because all sorts of errors creep in. After all, what is perfect parenting? Is perfect parenting the parent who protects their child, doesn't let them experience stress or fear, who gets involved in that child's life just to make sure their track through life is perfect? Is perfect parenting the opposite of that, where you just let the child do anything that they want? Your interpretation of what is perfect parenting could well be quite damaging. And what I say in the book is that it's good enough to be good enough, to recognize that you have a one-to-one relationship with each child. It's different, and it's just got to be good enough, and that's pretty good. So sometimes you'll lose the rag and have a yell at your kids because they've just gone too far. But it's once in a blue moon that you do that, but you don't feel good about it. Every parent does that. You mustn't hit your child, but every so often your anger spills over, and your child sees that you're normal. And but if you yell at them 24/7, that's when you create a parenting problem, because you've got nowhere to go. If your mode of parenting, instead of being quiet and calm and emotionally controlled, is yelling and over the top, then the child does not learn from you that modulation. But if the child sees that occasionally you do lose it but can bring it back in, that's fine. It's good enough, and it avoids making mistakes in the search for perfection.
Let's move to a piece of research that I found very interesting, something that suggests that race-related experiences of discrimination and segregation in childhood were actually linked to increased levels of inflammation, physical inflammation. And that comes under the chapter heading of weathering and the idea that genes may be affected by weathering. What should we understand about this research and the term weathering?
The idea of weathering comes from a researcher in the United States, particularly looking at Black populations. It intersects with the work of an expatriate Australian researcher in London, Professor Sir Michael Marmot, and also the late Professor Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University in New York, who looked at the effects of chronic stress on the brain and the body. Now, chronic stress is stress where you do not feel or do not have control over the decisions in your life, either because of poverty, disadvantage, lousy job, and so on. And that puts the brain, the immune system, essentially what the brain does is says, look, there's something going on in my environment here. I don't like it, and tells the rest of the body to get ready for some trouble. In the same way as you might in a fight or flight situation or warfare, or you've got to put your foot on the brake because a child's running out in front of your car. That acute stress in warfare or what have you is only designed to happen for an hour or two or a day or two. This chronic stress happens for weeks, months, years. And so the body is on alert. And when the body goes on alert, even if it's at a low level, the body is getting ready for action. It doesn't know what action it's getting ready for, but it gets ready for action. The immune system flares up, ready to protect itself like an artillery barrage, and that's called inflammation. And that can wear out tissues, weathering. Your blood pressure goes up a little bit. Your pulse goes up a little bit. Hormonal systems change, ready for something bad happening to the body. But something acutely bad doesn't happen to the body, but the stress continues. And it changes the brain, and it changes the way the body works. And it's very potent in early childhood. And that EDI I was talking about earlier, that's partly weathering as well, as that's the environment having an influence on this child's brain, probably indirectly as much as directly. And what this researcher described was that is that the experience of racism and alienation in Black populations in the United States changes kids' brains and reshapes them. And she calls that weathering. It's just this constant erosion by the battering of the weather. But in this case, it's social and prejudicial weather.
Let's move on to what we actually put into ourselves and what we put into our kids. Spaghetti and pizza seems to be the mainstay of childhood diets, not an ideal menu. But what do you say to parents, the parents of children who won't eat anything else?
It doesn't help a parent who's got a 5-year-old who's still fussy, in terms of what I'm about to say. But it does start in early childhood. First, the second 6 months of life when you're introducing solids usually go quite well. Around about 12 months, something changes. Child starts throwing stuff off the high chair, refusing food, and what have you. What should happen right about the age of 12 months is that the child starts to eat at the same time as you and starts to eat the same food as you, albeit modified. And so it normalizes that eating and normalizes the fact that they're eating adult food, and their diet is not dominated by milk anymore. So it's water. And you certainly should not be using toddler formula. But children become fussy eaters. If you let that bother you, then you get into a real food fight. And my chapter heading there is food fights. You do not want to get into food fights. It takes up to 20 times of presenting broccoli to a toddler for them to even taste it, much less like it. But eventually they will taste it, and eventually they will accept it as part of their diet. And it requires immense patience and tolerance that you're just going to go along with this, but keep on presenting the food. And also pick up on the signals from the child when they're full. They don't want to eat anymore. You don't get worried that they're getting malnourished. You just stop feeding them and let them sit there until everybody else has finished their meal, or however you want to manage that. But if you succumb to the fussy eating and or start to get scared of presenting new foods because the child's going to reject it and worried about overprotection, the risk is that you start to provide that child with ultra-processed foods, which are dressed up by the global food industry. They don't tell you it's an ultra-processed food when you buy a toddler milk formula over the counter or toddler foods. They make out that it's got natural ingredients. There's nothing natural about a toddler milk. It's a completely unnatural, ultra-processed food, which is over-sweetened, too many calories, and actually fills up the child and stops them eating a normal diet. They're poisonous foods, socially and nutritionally, not going to kill the child, but you get to the problem. So the global food industry is intervening in this process. You can end up with a child who is super fussy at age 5. Now, there's always some children who have odd eating practices, but they're still pretty well nourished and they're doing quite well. But you don't give up on them, and you do not use unhealthy food as a reward. So in other words, you say, well, if you eat your broccoli, you can have some chocolate cake. You might decide that there's going to be chocolate cake that evening instead of a normal dessert, which is fine, but you don't make any big deal of it. And you certainly don't use it as a reward. You might decide that there's a nuanced way of dealing with it, but you don't make unhealthy food special. And you don't have fights over unhealthy food. And what I talk about in the book is covert and overt restriction of unhealthy food. So a family where there's overt restriction, where they make a big fuss about unhealthy food, they phone parties that the children's going to, they're not allowed to have fairy bread or sausages, and there's fights over it, then that is bad. That will increase the likelihood that the child eats unhealthy food and may well increase the likelihood of them becoming overweight. And usually in that situation, there's unhealthy food in the house. So the child knows there's chicken nuggets in the freezer and knows there's chocolate in the pantry. Covert restriction, on the other hand, does work. And that's where you just don't buy these foods. There's no chocolate in the pantry. There's no chicken nuggets in the freezer. You don't use unhealthy food as a temptation, and there's nothing to fight over. And the same goes for fast food outlets. If you're on a long trip and you stop at a fast food outlet for a meal, you don't say, oh, this is some special thing. Isn't this great? You're getting a chance to eat these burgers. It's just a matter of fact thing that you're stopping and you're having it. You don't make a big deal about it. And if 4 or 5 times a year, you stop at a fast food outlet for your kids, the child is not going to die of coronary heart disease or become obese. But if you make a huge deal of it and you drive past it in a search for something healthy when you're on a motorway, you're on a hiding to nothing here. So you've got to normalize stuff and only fight the battles that are worth fighting without making things worse.
There's a very interesting chapter on warmth in relation to parenting style, which you define as showing love and affection. But there's a caveat, and that is we show that love and affection within the frame of limits to what's acceptable in your child's behaviour. And this is where perhaps a grey area arises between those two. What's your advice in navigating that area?
Sticking to my thing that I don't give advice, I can tell you what the evidence is. And the evidence, a lot of the evidence comes from Australian research, actually, one of which is the Australian Temperament Project in Melbourne, which has now been going 40 years. And so parents were recruited originally with young babies, and these young babies have now had their own babies. So they know a lot about these parents. They know a lot about these kids as parents in terms of the third generation. And this is the whole transmissible parenting thing, what's transmissible and what's not, et cetera, et cetera. And so they know the patterns of parenting that tend to be associated with good outcomes or less good outcomes. So if you're at the cold end of the scale, you have trouble expressing emotion, trouble expressing love to your children, it's not great. And if you're at the warm end of the scale, it's hard to imagine there's anything bad about the warm end of the scale. But overlaid on top of that scale, cold to warm, is what you were just talking about. It's old-fashioned things like the child knows what's expected of them. You set expectations. A lot of parents say to themselves, oh, I'm not going to set expectations. That's going to turn them into a neurotic wreck. The opposite is true. What a child needs and wants is predictability, consistency, and routine. And that's within the framework of boundaries in terms of what's acceptable in terms of their behavior, boundaries in terms of 7 o'clock is bath and bedtime. These are regular spots and you get read to, and you can predict that that's going to happen. If you are cold and harsh and a disciplinarian, that's not associated with good outcomes for your child. You might think it's going to be, but it's not. It tends to breed a child who's got mental health issues, maybe drug and alcohol. It's sweeping generalization. Plenty of kids do okay, but there's a tendency to not do well. Then you go to the warm end of the scale and you say, well, what could be bad at the warm end of the scale? This is all good. A parent who just loves their child and expresses them, hugging them all the time. Well, if you're at the extreme end of the warm scale and you say to yourself, I'm not going to set child's expectations. I do not want to turn them into a neurotic wreck. The child's going to learn from their own mistakes. I'm not going to set the boundaries here. that child ends up, again, a generalization, as an entitled adult who doesn't necessarily complete university degrees or courses that they go on. When they get into a new job, after a week, they know better than anybody else how the job should be done. Everybody else is an idiot, and a month later, they've lost their job. It's actually quite toxic in a very different way. Whereas you don't have to compromise on the warmth. The child knows you love them, but knows what its limits are. So parenting tends to be quite chaotic at that extreme end of warmth. And chaotic parenting is not good for kids. They find school a very difficult transition because school is about routine and predictability and control and emotional control. So you can't think of the cold to warm by itself. You've got to layer on top of that limits, boundaries, discipline, expectations. And then on top of that is how protective you are as a parent. And if you're overprotective, trying to protect your child from getting into stressful situations in the first place, and also making decisions for your child, the sort of helicopter type parenting that tends to evolve in the later ages and in high school more strongly, then the child does not develop another part, a really important trajectory in life, which is autonomy. The child's got to learn how to make decisions for themselves, how to respond to different circumstances. And part of the anxiety problem in primary school years that people are seeing could well be that children don't know what to do in various circumstances because they've either spent too much time in screens, not actually been doing developmentally appropriate activities, or they've not been allowed to make decisions for themselves. And therefore, it creates a quandary for them, which is stressful and anxiety provoking.
Your training is in paediatrics and you are yourself a parent. Does the medical science, the science, sometimes conflict with the everyday practicalities of parenting?
100%. In the book, and going back to what we talked about before, is that it's not good to aspire to being a perfect parent. And you've just got to be a good enough parent. And you can't stick to some rule book that you might have learned in a parenting handbook. You've got to make decisions about each child in your own right. And sometimes that breaks a few rules because it's right for that child. And the fact that you've had a training in pediatrics does not necessarily, and I'm not talking about any other pediatrically trained person, but does not necessarily make you a better parent. It actually might make you a more anxious parent because then a child gets something ordinary and you think they've got something terrible and rare. But if you actually saw a GP, the GP says, cool it, baby, your child's got a cold. It does not have leukemia. That's the downside of having training, is that you overinterpret the normal.
Dr. Norman Swan, thanks so much for your insights. There's so much more to explore in this book than we've covered today. And thank you so much for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you very much.
I've been talking to Dr. Norman Swan about his new book, So You Want to Know What's Good for Your Kids. It's published by Hachette, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. This Good Reading Podcast was brought to you by Book People Gift Cards. Share the joy of reading with a Book People gift card. To find out more, visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au.